Hello and welcome to the Ori Spotlight Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Foster. This week, we're lucky to have Warner Biddle, the CEO of Kyverna Therapeutics, with us. Welcome, Warner.
Hey, Jason. Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks so much for joining us, and hope things in California are okay today. It's probably early for you, I'm guessing.
It's not too bad. Yeah, we could get a little bit of rain today, but the weekend was beautiful.
Well, I'd love to start out the discussion just by spending a bit of time on your background. I know you spent more than, not to date you, but more than 3 decades launching breakthrough medicines. Whenever I say that I've been in the field for 25 or 30 years, it always makes me feel old, but it means we're experienced, right? So, but you've been launching medicines across oncology, ophthalmology, and cell therapy for several decades. It'd be great if you just fill us in a little bit about your career journey prior to Kyverna and what drew you to this opportunity.
Sure. Over 30 years does make me sound old, but started my career in Canada, really maybe in the traditional sense, carrying the bag and working my way up, if you will. Started in Canada, working at Glaxo in the middle of the country in Saskatchewan, which is where I was born. Ended up moving to Toronto, which is where I met my wife, and working in the home office there. Then we both got jobs and moved over to Europe, and we worked in London and then in Switzerland for a little while with Glaxo and Novartis, and then back to Canada with kids. And about 15 years ago now, moved back, had the opportunity to move to the States. I'd been working on 2 brands for Novartis, which were actually co-marketed from Genentech. And both those brands I launched in Canada, one in ophthalmology, one in respiratory diseases, and ended up doing fairly well with that. And that got me on the radar. So came down about 15 years ago and basically raised our kids in the Bay Area, working at Genentech for many years there. Ended my career in the last sort of 5 years working on oncology. And that really opened up the door to moving over to Kite, which at the time was at this really interesting inflection point of, off to an early launch. But I think there were a lot of questions about the viability of CAR T and whether it could be scaled and whether this could actually get to a number of different patients. So I was really excited about joining that organization back in 2020. And we had a really incredible run there, as you know, in terms of really transforming that business and making it more available and more accessible for patients over the last few years. But during that time as well, of course, all of us were watching how this transformative impact of CAR T therapies was having on hematological diseases and what would that mean for potentially autoimmune diseases as well. And that's what attracted me to Kyverna, because I saw the power of what we were doing with CAR T in heme. I'm really excited about being here and really accelerating this young company into a position where we can not just help a few patients, but help thousands of patients.
It's not an overstatement to say I think the industry at large is extremely excited about the opportunities in autoimmune, and Kyverna being one of the leaders in that space. Just give us a quick update, if you don't mind, before we move forward in the discussion about kind of the latest at Kyverna, where the company is. I know you've got several products either in clinical trials or rapidly approaching.
Yeah, it's been a really exciting 9 months. I joined Kyverna back in September, and really it was an exciting company, and there was a lot of promise, to your point. We saw a lot of early, really amazing results in some of these patients being treated, but there wasn't really a pathway forward. But how do we get this to 500 or 5,000 patients? And what's the next step? So really the work that I've been doing with the leadership team over the past few months here is really focusing the organization around a few key priorities, around a few key milestones, putting forward a really clear pathway that we rolled out at JP Morgan back in January about how we're going to take KYV-101, which is our lead construct, and really focus this around a few key indications. And we're starting with neuroinflammation indications, 2 in particular, stiff person syndrome and myasthenia gravis, both of which have huge unmet needs in terms of patients. Stiff person syndrome has no approved therapies. Myasthenia gravis has a number of therapies that are now coming forward, but still in both cases, these patients have huge unmet needs in terms of the clinical impacts that they are facing with these diseases. We're focusing on those as our 2 lead indications. We're also working on a clinical study in lupus nephritis as well, phase 1 that's reading out in the second half of this year. And those are really the focus, if you will, in terms of 3 key indications for the lead construct, which is KYV-101. And then in parallel, we're also looking a little bit ahead, Jason, at what's the next generation of these therapies? How do we make CAR T therapies easier and simpler to use? How do we increase patient access and make the patient journey simpler? So we're also working on two backup constructs. One is called KYV-102, which is a whole blood construct, so you don't have to have an apheresis step for patients. And it has a rapid manufacturing process as well, which allows us to, as you're very familiar with, reduce cost of goods, reduce the turnaround time for patients, and in a sense, bring these to patients quicker, but also make their experience easier and access better. So that's our next generation construct. And then in addition, we have KYV-201, which is an allogeneic construct, which is based off the same background. Both these are based off the same background as KYV-101, so it has the same core CAR T construct, if you will. But 201 is an allogeneic form, and it's one that it's further back in terms of its development, but one that we think has exciting opportunities down the line.
Amazing. Yeah, no, super exciting opportunities for the company. And you touched on a couple issues that regularly get discussed on the Spotlight, which is manufacturability, scale up, commercial viability. And I wonder, from your kind of vantage point as a CEO of Kyverna, what headlines are kind of trends or shaping the next generation of CAR T, those and others?
Yeah, well, I really think if you just take a step back, we're at a really interesting point of the journey of CAR T right now. You hit this initial, I think, fervor, if you will, around the excitement and the clinical impact that it has on patients is truly remarkable, as we both know. But with any new therapy, you hit this sort of S-curve innovation where there's this initial excitement that comes there, and then people take a step back and say, "Oh, but this is different, and we're going to have to do this in a different way. And if we're going to scale this up and bring this to patients, we're going to maybe have to do some things completely differently if we're going to really get this to a lot of other patients right now." And I think that's what's happening right now. But I mean, if you take a step back, in all honesty, I really think what's happening now in the dialogue around CAR T is the impact that we're having on patients is truly being underappreciated. But the challenges and the difficulties around administering, or the differences, if you will, in terms of administering these therapies, is being overblown. And I think we've made a lot of progress even since I've, got into the space 5-6 years ago, even where we were at Kite, but it's a relatively new space, as you know, and I think we've made this tremendous progress in terms of manufacturing scalability. To your point, I think the consistency of manufacturing and the ability to manufacture for patients at scale is increasing dramatically. It's not being concentrated in one or two companies. Your company, others are all working around how to transform this and make this easier to use and make it cheaper and make the cost of goods more affordable for patients and for the system. And all of that is happening in real time right now, where I think it's really accelerating, but we haven't really seen all of that impact in terms of how this is being viewed in the marketplace right now. So in addition to manufacturing, I mean, you look at even patient access and what we've been doing in terms of scaling up the number of centers that are able to treat and use CAR T in these different centers. That has increased dramatically over the past 5 years, and the ability to actually move these into a broader sense into the community and make this easier for use and bring this closer to patients is also happening in real time right now. So I think we're just at this tip of the spear, if you will, where the impact of CAR T on patients individually is truly making its way, but the impact on the masses is coming up behind it. But there's a lot of transformative changes that are happening in the macro environment that's allowing that to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a topic, as you know, that gets discussed all the time within the industry, and part of the sort of impatience, if you will, with cell therapy kind of reaching scale is the incredible kind of transformative impact these therapies have.
Mm-hmm.
And we haven't seen that kind of incredible impact really before, transformative impact. And, we've been at this for 10 or 15 years, but, it took us 25 years to get good at it in the biologics world. So I agree with you 100% that, the impact maybe is understated, but the impatience factor continues to grow. And we were at ICT over the last couple of weeks in New Orleans, and I said a couple of times from stage, we're kind of at the pit of despair. I think the investment markets are challenging. Obviously, there's a lot of concern around tariffs and changes at the FDA. And I would be worried if these products were only incrementally or marginally more a marginal improvement above what the current status or the current state of care is. As you said, many of these cell therapies are addressed to diseases that have no standard of care, really, no good alternatives. And these are transformative therapies. So it's not that we're incrementally better; we are changing the outcome for patients. So that kind of therapy doesn't go away. That doesn't just sort of fade into the distance. We as an industry need to figure some things out around COGS and manufacturing and some other things. But this modality is here to stay, in my opinion, and isn't going anywhere.
I agree. I mean, I keep reminding our teams that we're not playing for singles and doubles here. We're playing for literally grand slams with these.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, just going a little bit deeper on one particular disease area, which we have a lot of focus around, myasthenia gravis. I think the outcomes and the journey that these patients are on is being totally underestimated with current standards of care. Many of these patients, suffer horribly over the course of many years. And even with the advent of new therapies like the FcRn inhibitor, the FcRn inhibitors, the complement inhibitors, they are having some marginal impact in terms of reducing MG-ADL scores, for example, or whatever. But patients are not getting a complete remission of their disease or giving them a chance at walking away disease free with their condition the way we are, and we're doing this in a way that's completely different. As you know, it's a one-time treatment. And there's a process to make that happen, but it's a one-time treatment. And then, like our initial first patient, Denise, who I've referenced in many settings before, we've now reported out, and it's been reported out in other settings. She's now out at 23 months post her initial CAR T treatment. She doesn't need to take the FcRns or the complement. She's not on IVIG. She's not on background immunosuppressants or steroids. And this is somebody who, prior to getting CAR T therapy, was in and out of the ICU every 3 months with these myasthenia crises. She was on intubation. She's on feeding tubes. She couldn't walk. So truly a remarkable transformative impact. And all of the initial patients that we're treating are having, to a large degree, this same kind of an impact. So that gives us a lot of hope that we're onto something bigger than just a marginal impact for patients, to your point. And I know it gives me and gives my team, and I think it's giving the industry a lot of energy, to your point a few minutes ago, on we've got to solve these things because patients are waiting. Patients are looking for something really different, and this is what we believe is gonna have that impact.
Absolutely. No, that's fantastic. And you led right into my next question, which is, a lot of these autoimmune patients are in for essentially a lifetime of, chronic disease management with systems that can persist, forever. What makes cell therapy, for the non-scientists on the podcast and myself included, what makes cell therapy kind of uniquely suited to transform the clinical outcomes for these patients?
Well, I think they tend to be mediated by B cells, and the ability to target those B cells in a broad sense, and a significant reduction or elimination of these B cells, and give patients a chance at repopulating with naive B cells, gives them a chance to have an immune reset and gives them a chance to actually have this transformative clinical outcome. And that's exactly what we're seeing with KYV-101, which is our lead construct, and other CAR Ts being studied in the space. But with KYV-1 in particular, because it's a CD19, it has that broad coverage and ability to reduce the broad sense of the pathogenic B cells that are involved in these diseases. At the same time, it's the only construct that's a CD28 co-stimulatory domain, fully humanized, which means it's been designed for this deep B cell depletion quite rapidly, as it's also designed for safety. So we're seeing like no high-grade CRS and ICANS in particular, which makes this actually easier to administer for patients. And so all these things coming together, I think, and all the learnings that we've seen over the last several years on how to not only design CAR Ts, but how to administer them, are coming to the forefront here, where we're seeing, hey, autoimmune diseases are probably an excellent area where we can help a lot of patients. And these therapies in particular are specifically designed to actually help them do that. So that's why we're here. That's why Kyverna is excited about what we're doing, and excited about where we're at on this part of the journey so that we can continue to move forward. And like I said, we don't want to help, a few patients. We want to help thousands of patients. So this is why we're here doing what we're doing.
It's often discussed how autoimmune indications could be a kind of paradigm shift for cell therapy. Obviously, most cell therapies, as you referenced, are focused in heme malignancies in the first part, and then a couple solid tumor indications recently, melanoma and synovial sarcoma, with
Mm-hmm.
different approaches, a TIL and a TCR approach for those.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
the idea that, autoimmune, and correct me if I get this wrong, but, my understanding is a lot of the autoimmune patients are often younger, their treatment situation is maybe a little less acute, still acute for some, but a little less acute than some of the late stage cancer patients. So for many of these autoimmune indications, we're going to have to think differently about how we commercialize, how we manufacture, the site of treatment, kind of scalability of these therapies. How are you thinking about sort of long-term success for your products, and how we overcome the commercial viability challenges that those kind of first generation of CAR T therapies has faced?
Yeah, I think those are really important questions. The work that we're doing and others in terms of how to make these therapies simpler and easier to use is actually at the forefront of what we're doing. Even though we're at a clinical stage right now, we're thinking ahead to the commercialization and
Mm-hmm.
answering those exact questions. Um, I think there's a few things that have changed and that we've learned over the last few years that I think can apply and really lean into this simplification of the process and bringing it to patients. First of all, the design of the constructs, and as I mentioned, is getting more strategic. We're understanding how do we design these constructs for potency and efficacy while at the same time making sure that they have viable safety profiles. And with our lead construct, the fact that we have this safety profile that can be used in a very limited way from an academic footprint perspective gives us confidence that as we develop KYV-101, it will be an outpatient product. And when I say outpatient, I mean being able to, you have the apheresis step, of course, and patients come in for leukapheresis and the treatment, but patients can then leave the hospital. They don't have to stay in the hospital for 14 days or,
Right.
21 days or 28 days like CAR Ts were, initially mandating for these patients. That makes it easier. It actually increases the effective capacity in the system, if you will, from a hospital perspective. And even as hospitals now are adding more beds, they're adding more staff, the fact that the footprint, if you will, or the impact of CAR Ts on using those available resources is going down. I mean, the
Mm-hmm.
capacity in the system right now is effectively increasing. At the same time, we're also seeing a move to non-academic centers or more community hospitals starting to establish CAR T centers for themselves as well. And they're
Yes.
doing that through a number of different changes in the system. This whole idea of FACT accreditation, which is what CAR Ts were anchored in when they were initially being launched, because of course it was coming off the back of transplant therapy and they needed something
Mm-hmm.
to reference. So of course they referenced FACT accreditation, but as you know, that's probably overdoing it in this space, because FACT accreditation was put in place to manage and oversee and allow academic centers to oversee the manipulation of T cells in their institutions from a transplant perspective. But we're the ones actually managing that process now, and companies like yourself are doing that. So FACT
Mm-hmm.
accreditation is probably an overblown process right now, and work is ongoing right now in order to simplify that so that we can move these into community settings where maybe the level of support is less sophisticated, but it is certainly at enough of a level that we can actually administer these therapies in right now. So I think those things are happening. In addition, I think there's an increase of focus around the value of CAR T and what does it mean from a payer perspective and from a health economic perspective. The fact that these are one and done therapies means that the impact on the system over time and the need for retreatment with all these other standards of care right now is reduced, or in some cases, as we mentioned, eliminated. That also is being built into the system. And so I think having a paradigm shift at how we're thinking about how to manage these diseases. And I think over time, as we continue to work to make them simpler and easier to use, bring the cost of goods down as well with some of the new technologies and automation that's happening, we'll be able to actually increase the scalability of this and bring this to more patients.
Absolutely. I think one topic that isn't often discussed but is significant is, when let's say a patient's getting CAR T therapy at a specialist oncology center, they often have to move themselves and their families for months, to be close to that center. It could be Houston or New York or Minnesota or wherever they're being treated. But for patients that are employed and active and in the community, that kind of disruption probably would be too difficult. So bringing it into the community absolutely makes sense. And even Legend, I think, in their earnings call mentioned that 30+% of the patients that they're dosing, even in multiple myeloma, is happening in the community. So we're seeing this modality spread its wings out into the community, and to normalize this treatment for other types of patients and other patient populations is absolutely critical, I think, to the long-term success, both clinical and commercial success.
Yeah. I love that word normalized, by the way. I think and it's natural when you come up with something completely different and paradigm shifting as CAR T therapy is, you focus in on that and you make that the headline. When in a sense, if you break it down into its components, apheresis, leukapheresis, just administering the therapies, managing some of these relatively mild AEs, especially with these new constructs. All of these things are things that community hospitals can do, and are doing now in different settings. So we can do the work behind the scenes as Kyverna's and the Oris and others in terms of doing that hard work around the manufacturing stuff. But from a patient's perspective or a physician's perspective, we can design the system so it's more seamless and easier for them to get the access and move through the treatment journey. And I think we're making a lot of progress. Like I said, I think there's a lot of learnings over the last 6-7 years that even when I started, like I said, back at Kite in 2020, there was tons of these questions that were happening, and we're, I think, making tremendous progress ever since then.
Yeah. You guys were building the plane while sailing it back in 2020. It feels a little bit like that still, but we've definitely made significant progress. One of the areas that I wanted to touch on that it probably is a paradigm shift required is really this kind of idea of the treatment mechanism. We talked about kind of the actual how you actually go about treating patients, but also the reimbursement models for oncology are unlikely to map directly onto chronic diseases like autoimmune disease and others. How do you think kind of payers and providers should be thinking about value when a potentially curative therapy like yours could replace, years of prospective drug maintenance and drug spend that they would normally be incurring?
Yeah, I think you touched on an important point there with the need for education. I know when we were, looking at launching some of these indications into the heme space, that was a really important part of the education. This idea of a one and done therapy, and what does that actually mean for healthcare systems, and how do we help them understand the risk benefit trade off and the value for them from an investment perspective, and what does that mean for their patients? I think we're going to have to do the same thing in the autoimmune space. The good news is I think we're going to have an incredible story to tell. If you look at just going back to myasthenia gravis again, the level and number of treatments that these patients are needing in order to just get some moderate control of their disease on the FcRNs or the complement inhibitors or IVIGs. You look it up, that costs the system hundreds of thousands of dollars just with those medications alone. Right. And you compound the multiple doctor visits that are needed, the impact for these patients. You mentioned a lot of them are younger and tend to be of working age. So, the time away to get those therapies and treatments over time, a lot of times they're also being driven by a caregiver in order to get access to these therapies as well. So, and then, they're still suffering with the disease.
Right.
They're still living with the disease and still being impacted in not insignificant ways with breakthroughs that require additional emergency care, et cetera. So when you add it all up, and I think that's part of our job, it's part of the job that all of us in this space are going to have to tell a more coherent story. But the impact of a one and done therapy that, yes, is a process that patients will have to go through for a couple of weeks in order to gain access to it, but the opportunity then to have and live a life where you don't have to have all these chronic therapies building up over time is a huge advantage to the system, and one that I believe, and I mean, we're still, finishing our clinical trials, and obviously we're not at the point of commercialization yet. But I can see from this perspective now, and from my previous experience, this is going to be highly cost effective in the system. But it's going to require some education about the before and after, and what does this mean. I think in a lot of cases we're, have learned a lot about how do we do risk sharing as well with these payers. So we know that the longer that patients can stay out in terms of this transformative impact, the greater the benefit. And so how do we share and align with payers on that, so that we're part of the solution with them on that. But I think ultimately there's going to be a great story to tell.
Yeah, no, 100% agree. I mean, one of the things that gets overlooked with even the current generation of CAR T therapies, moving to second line, and people talk about how quote unquote expensive they are. A bone marrow transplant costs $500,000 in the U.S. That's hospital visits. That's all the other associated costs. The costs are not that different with current standard of care at second line. So we really have it, taking a broad view of all of the impacts. Because in the U.S., as you know, you often have the pharmacy benefit, which is separate from the medical benefit, and costs end up in both buckets, but rarely get brought together when you look holistically at costs. So I have no doubt that given the profile of some of the patients that you're helping, I mean, the patient you just referenced, Denise, like ending up in the ER and relapsing, I'm sure, missing days of work and all kinds of other things, or inability to work even. You said inability even to walk maybe. I mean, these are significant health benefits that these patients will be realizing from your therapies. Wanted to just kind of dig a bit deeper on that. And you mentioned one thing, which I loved earlier, saying, we're already thinking about commercialization, even preclinical. We're in early stage clinical. We need to be thinking about that end game, thinking with the end in mind, which is one of the themes that Ori's been beating the drum on for quite a while. I'd love it if you could tell me a little bit more about kind of the autoimmune space. A lot of entrants came in kind of at one time. It was seen as a new area to explore. Some have now removed themselves. But I think, I'd love to know more about your view and your perspective on Kyverna's leadership in this area. There's whole new, not only therapeutic products that have to be developed, but whole new, we talked about reimbursement a little bit, a whole new manufacturing, whole new delivery mechanisms. I'd be interested in how you're thinking about the class, as it were, the cell therapy approach to the treatment of autoimmune disease, and what Kyverna is doing really to kind of front run some of those issues that are coming down the pike.
You touched on something that I think is really important. I think we're leveraging our leadership here in order to help create and shape that. We think that's going to be a competitive advantage for us. Like I said, we had this initial body of patient data, if you will, across many different indications. And what I've been working on here is to focus this on a few, so we can be first and lead. And I'll be announcing this an update on our clinical trials and our progress at our earnings later this week. But we're fully enrolled in our pivotal study for stiff person syndrome. We're fully enrolled in our phase 2 with myasthenia gravis right now. We're reading out results for myasthenia gravis and lupus nephritis in the second half of this year. We're moving up our guidance to read out the stiff person syndrome clinical results, and also file our BLA in the first half of 2026. So all of this is actually moving really, really quickly, which is exciting for us as a young company. But it means, to your point, that we're also thinking ahead of what does this mean from a eventual commercialization perspective. And the good news is the indications that we've chosen, and we've chosen them very deliberately, will allow us to actually move in a very thoughtful and logical way. We won't have to invest and scale up and have a complete academic center, authorized treatment center network in place on day one. We know we can establish that in a few key centers and build up and scale up over time, simply because of the indications we pick. Stiff person syndrome, myasthenia gravis will allow us to move in a relatively concentrated way while we continue to build up our infrastructure, as well as build up sales within the area, and allow us to complement that as we move forward and scale up as an organization and move to larger and larger indications in the future. But that has to be done in a thoughtful way. We are obviously looking at investments in what we're calling Kyverse, which is a patient management system that, as you know, you need to manage the chain of identification for patients, chain of custody of these patients over the course of time. So there's some structural investments in that regard, and we're making significant investments in our CMC package as well, and our manufacturing capabilities, and making sure those are registered and approved from an FDA perspective. But what's good there again is we've got a lot of synergies. We can use the same package for stiff person syndromes for myasthenia gravis. So it's all about using these synergies in order to build scale over time. I think that's going to create some advantages for us, and then we can continue to grow the company as we continue to develop new indications into the future.
And you and I have discussed a little bit about how, an indication the size of lupus, let's say at 50,000 patients a year, I think all told, if you look at the numbers, the industry has treated 30 to 40,000 patients in its entirety since 2017. So, big indications like lupus and others will cause us to need to think differently about manufacturing, delivery, scale. The next generation of platforms like Ori's is really built with that in mind. This idea to have automation and digital that can really scale up to those tens of thousands of doses. But it seems like, certainly the staged approach that you're articulating makes a ton of sense based on where we are today.
And I think we're also in a different position versus, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, when the manufacturing for these constructs was highly concentrated in a few key companies. I think what you're showing with Ori, and there's other companies as well that we're partnering with, is that the CMO model can actually work really well, because we always said that volume's your friend in a lot of cases. And if you can manage that volume across multiple companies and multiple different indications, you can provide more flexibility in terms of access and delivery for patients and customers. You can also bring cost of goods down. And I think that we're hitting a tipping point there, where this capacity in the system and the options that we have in terms of manufacturing will help us do that. And then you layer on what you guys are doing in terms of automation and next generation constructs. That's going to improve it even more over time. So I'm really optimistic that we're moving in the right direction, and this is going to get easier and more ubiquitous for patient access, and bring the total cost of these therapies down, while improving the ability to get them to them quicker and closer to where they live.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I mean, that's the whole goal, right? I mean, what's the point of having these therapies available if we can't get them to patients? And, one of the things that we've been doing on our side is partnering with other best of breed technology providers like Fresenius Kabi, who has the kind of the Lovo and the Q system, as you know, MaxSite, on the technology layer, so that people like yourselves and others can select the best technologies available to deliver the outcome that you're expecting at the scale that you're hoping for and the cost. But also, we've just launched something called the Preferred Partner Network, which essentially partners us with the leading CDMOs in this space. So think Charles River, Kincell, Elevate Bio, CPMC. These are kind of leaders in the space that can serve different purposes for companies throughout their life cycle. So early stage research, kind of R&D, translation, PD, commercial scale, or clinical scale, and then commercial scale manufacturing, but ultimately allowing flexibility in the system, because not every cell therapy process is the same. Not every company is going to have the same needs. So the ability to plug and play, best service provider, best technologies together, we feel is really the approach that's going to be necessary to allow the flexibility to get to the scales you want with the different products that you're launching as an industry, and not limiting flexibility, which unfortunately has often been the case when we try and move to automation and other elements. So it's that kind of idea of flexibility being absolutely essential for the next phase of this industry.
Yeah, that is really exciting, and that, to your point, is going to allow us to scale and do it at in a more cost-effective way. So I'm really excited by the work that you guys are doing, and others in the space. I think, like I said, I think we're not quite there yet, but we're going to be hitting a golden age of CAR T manufacturing and technology that'll be coming over the next 10 years. I think people are underestimating the impact that it's going to have.
I agree. I mean, I think, I said this from stage a couple of weeks ago at a conference, just that I don't think, as enabling technology providers, that we've done that good a job supporting the industry. We're still using tools, most of us, that are 10 years old, until, Euro came to market and a couple other platforms in the last 12 months. There hadn't been much innovation. So, we need to accelerate that innovation and ensure that the next generation of therapies has this at their disposal to really get to the patient numbers that we're hoping to reach. So ultimately, we're coming to the end of our time together, and thanks again so much for taking time today. I might ask you, if you don't mind, just to pull out your crystal ball and look a bit forward. Yours is probably as dusty as mine is these days, but I'd be interested to hear kind of your outlook for the next, let's say, 5, maybe even 10 years, to help predict the future of cell therapy, not only for autoimmune, of course, but also for the kind of broader category of diseases. We're seeing innovation even in things like type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease or glioblastoma. There's a huge array of indications that are being studied for cell therapies, and I'd love to just understand your point of view of where we're going to be in the next 5 to 10 years, and what patients in the industry should be optimistic about.
Well, I think we've touched on some of these through the course of this conversation, which has been really, really great to be sitting here with you and talking about this. But I think the positive acceleration that we've made so far is only just beginning. The early impact of autologous therapies and how we're working to make them simpler and easier and cheaper to use so that patients can get more access. I think that work's going to continue. We'll be a part of that, but a number of other companies will be as well. I think the education level in the system and what this actually means for patients and caregivers and the average person out there will become more aware. I mean, I don't know about you, but whenever you meet somebody that doesn't work in the industry or maybe doesn't work even tangentially to healthcare, ask you about what you do, and you describe what you do and the impact that CAR T
Blows people's minds. Yeah,
it
totally.
blows people's minds, and they're always like, they say, "How come I don't know about that?"
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think there's a huge inflection point in terms of education that's going to help accelerate that, because I always say, sometimes paradigm shifts, nobody knows they're coming until they punch you in the face. And I think that's coming. And we are definitely a paradigm shift. So this early work on autologous therapies, I think will have a strong foreseeable future for the next few years. But as you know, I think the next generation constructs like what we're working on, KYV-102, which is, again, this whole blood rapid manufacturing construct, is one step in the right direction. I think allogeneic therapies and eventually in vivo therapies, I'm positively optimistic that they will have an impact on patients as well. I think it's going to take more time, but the investment and the excitement and the energy that everyone's putting into this means that it will have an impact in patients' lives, definitely in our lifetime, but probably sooner than everybody thinks. So I don't know about you, but there's a lot of different places and spaces where my career could have taken me over the last few years. I wake up every day feeling very fortunate and very blessed that I get to not only work in this industry, but work specifically on these exciting leading edge constructs that can have this kind of an impact in the system and on people and on patients, and working with really smart people like yourself and the people on my team in order to make it happen. So I'm really optimistic about the future.
100%. That's a great way to kind of close out our discussions. I think we're privileged to be in what is going to be, or is already, a golden age in biology, where we're curing intractable diseases that today patients die from or suffer greatly from. And I think the last couple of years have been difficult for the industry. No one's going to argue that 22, 23, and 24 have been a picnic, or even the first few months of 25. But ultimately, the transformative potential for these therapies is going to carry the day. We just need to figure out the right economic and commercial model to bring this next generation of therapies to patients at scale, not only in the U.S., but everywhere in the world. There's a huge unmet need out there globally. And so focusing on COGS, focusing on throughput, and just to put a finer point as we wind down here on one thing you said earlier, addressing these issues early. For those therapy developers out there that are listening, these are issues we have to be thinking about preclinical. We have to be thinking about manufacturability. We have to be thinking about COGS. We have to be thinking about commercial viability holistically alongside safety and efficacy. And if we do that, this next generation of therapies will be successful, and you'll see investment rushing back into this space because of the curative potential that it represents. A big thank you to you, Warner, for joining us. It's been great to see you again, and look forward to hopefully catching up at one of the next conferences, maybe bio or something else over the next few months.
You bet, Jason. I really appreciated the opportunity. Thanks for hosting me.
Take care.